So welcome back to Friends of Tracking. We're very excited today because we have Maram, who also just hit 20,000 followers on Twitter today. So this is like a double exciting day for, for her. And so she has these amazing graphics and also quite a bit of technical knowledge behind it. Already at 20 years old is working very actively in soccer analytics. So this is very exciting. And she's going to tell you a little bit in the start about her story. So I actually kind of want to let her do that. There's one thing I actually wanted to do first, though, was because your name, we all think it's a different name than it is. Did you want to very quickly tell people how you pronounce it and what it actually means?
Okay, so my name is Maram. I understand that you can't roll the R's quite easily as you can in Arabic, so that's fine. You can pronounce it any way you like. Maram is not Maryam. That's just a disclaimer. And my name basically means desire, ambition, or wish, or striving towards something, basically.
Okay. Amazing. So
I grew up in Scotland, so I can roll my R's. But, that's the only time I'm going to speak in a Scottish accent.
Amazing. Okay, so without further ado, would you like to get started? And you can just share your screen.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, just a second. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how Maram, a normal 20-year-old economics student, became Maram per 90. Maram per 90 is the official name of my brand on Twitter. And I'm basically beginning talking about my experience and how I broke through in the community in Twitter and then in the industry. And just a little bit about the techniques and where my visualizations have started and where they've come to. A little trick that I've made in this entire presentation is the majority of them are going to be in visualizations because this is what I specialize in. And I wanted to show you how I do it rather than just tell you about it. So a little bit about my journey in football. So around October 2018, I graduated from high school and I entered into an economics and management bachelor's program in the University of London and London School of Economics. And it was only up until 3 years later that I started my account in Twitter. Now you'll notice that nowhere in the timeline actually is something that has to do where I started supporting a club or where I started supporting Manchester United. Simply because I've always been an avid football fan ever since I was young. And I think that's what harnessed my desire to open a football account. People were starting to get sick of me talking about it all the time. So I set up my own Twitter account for all of the football. And the reason actually behind it is it's quite sad because it was the day that we lost 6-1, Manchester United lost 6-1 to Spurs. And I remember opening the commentary and all they were talking about was the mentality of players. And I remember being really upset because there was so much to talk about in terms of the physicality of players, the tactical structure, the data, but there was nothing. So I started my football account, and for 3 months, I was creating single match tactical threads, basically analyzing almost every game that Manchester United had in that period. And I was watching back matches 2, 3, 4 times a day while also being a full-time student. And that was good for a while and got me my exposure, but I realized I wanted something bigger. I wanted to look at something bigger than just single match data. As we know, in football, single matches have a lot of variance, and I wanted to look at the bigger picture. And the second idea I had is wanting to combine data and tactics. I wanted to use data and event data to explain a team's football tactical structure and why they played the way that they did and why they play the way that they do entire season. So that's why I chose to pick up Python. And I didn't take any professional course. All I had was the public resources, Friends of Tracking, MPL Soccer, FC Python. And it was 3 months later that I rebranded to Maram per 90. This is my favorite point in the timeline because I'm from Bahrain. It's a very tiny island, and a lot of my growing up involved me being expected to go into these orthodox traditional job routes like work in banking or work in consultancies or finance or economics. And I wanted something bigger for myself. And I think when I rebranded, it was when I started asking myself what I want to do with my career. Football started becoming the answer, and I wanted to take it to the next level. And that's when I rebranded. And coincidentally, after 2 months, I got approached by Analytics FC to write an article. I would not become the senior player analyst I am today immediately. I just asked to write articles, and I wrote a total of one, and it was covering Emi Buendia before I got poached by the data department, basically. So as an economics student and as someone that was looking outside into the football community, I really thought that you had to have a degree in sports science or coaching or some sort of background to be able to find a job in the industry. I was wrong because I realized that football is actually comes from all these different cultures and all these different backgrounds with players, and that's the same for employees as well. So I'm just going to be telling you about my experience as an economics major and how that those skills, my economic skills and my analytical skills, actually helped me make up my Twitter account and the content that I produce today. So let's starting in the green. So it really helped me communicate and present these really difficult concepts in a very easy, concise manner. Simply because Twitter was limited to 160 characters per tweet. I only had like 5-6 tweets before I lost the reader's attention, around 25-30 seconds to get them to click. So it really showed me to focus on the main events happening in a football match. I couldn't go into much detail. And then moving downwards, purple. I wanted to encourage the use of data in football simply as an industry. Now that I work in it, you begin to realize as a sport how much behind we are in not only just the clubs themselves, but as supporters. Yani, the terminology that you see being picked up, for example, by basketball fans is a huge gap between like football fans. And I actually wanted to encourage the use of it. And I wanted to show people that you can actually use data combined with tactics. They don't have to be separate routes. And I wanted to encourage people to look at the bigger picture always, because fans, as football fans, we tend to be very emotional and very reactionary. So we make up these conclusions based on one match or two match, and we say that, oh my God, this football team is bad. But no, I wanted to show people that you can look at an entire season's worth and you can see, well, no, they're not necessarily bad. They're just underperforming. One of the biggest examples is Brighton, for example, in this Premier League season. A lot of people saying they were bad, but their metrics were amazing. So I wanted to encourage people to look at the bigger picture. And most importantly, and that's something personal for me, just the pink one, is I am just generally a very intellectually curious person. Growing up, I had all of these questions about why does a team score the way that it does, and why did they choose this player, not this player? And I never really answered those questions. And I basically set up this platform as a way to feed my intellectual curiosity and share with people the questions that I had, and basically network and try to see if people try to gain a background and insight on if people had a different answer to that I did, and basically learn and apply context always. So always try to look at the bigger picture, always try to learn more. And that's a little bit about how my background helped me. If we have any questions, please feel free to go ahead.
I have some question. I really like this idea. You said you used Twitter in order to improve being concise in what you did. Could you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, definitely. So fun fact is when Analytics FC approached me, I had not written any single article. All I was doing was threads. And John McKenzie, I don't know if you know him, but he approached me based on my threads. And I didn't write any football article before then. I had to learn how to be concise in such a way that I couldn't be talking about things that aren't really relevant to the scoreline, just simply because of who my audience was and who was communicating it to. And I wanted to have that platform to be able to do that a bit more, and I get to do that now. But I had to reel in people first, try to get their attention. And it wasn't always easy because for example, let's say I have a majority of Manchester United football fans and you lost a game, they're not going to be wanting to read anything about the game after that. But it's important to actually dissect and understand why a team lost and what happened and what went wrong. But the encouragement wasn't really there for when we lost a game, and I had to find a way to try to present it in a very exciting way, just passing news in an exciting way. So yeah,
I think, I mean, what I love about your work is you make it very clear, so you're not scared of sort of giving very basic information about what's going on. And so you're not scared of saying what you're saying now is that you're addressing it straight to the fans, that it's the fans who want to understand these sorts of things, and you convey it to them. Because I think often in analytics, we possibly overestimate the football people's understanding. And so actually what you do then interprets, because you aim it at the fans, it then interprets as something that's very insightful for the trainers or the coaches or the other people who are working with analytics in another way.
Exactly. And I agree with that, because all of the questions I had were very basic questions, like, why did that team score that goal? And I thought it was a very simple answer. Oh, that player made that run. But when you actually look deeper into things, there's a lot of interesting insights you can gain from these very simple rudimentary coaching instructions, for example, and then you can begin to understand about how, for example, this player utilizes the other player, or how the entire team utilizes this player to do that. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I'm gonna maybe move into my next slide.
Yeah, sure.
One of my biggest questions that I get is how I make my visualizations. Considering I've been only here in the community for around 7 to 8 months, there has been a bit of a stark change between where I started my visualizations and where I am right now. So I like shocking people with this answer, actually. So 70% of my work is all in Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint. Because as a full-time student, I simply did not have the time or the resources to invest in Python programming courses or anything. So I wanted free, easy tools that I can use and someone like me can use. So to this day, I still use Microsoft PowerPoint and Excel to edit the majority of my work. But when I wanted to look at the bigger picture, I started doing Python. And what's really nice about when I entered, I hear a lot of people saying now, I don't know, I was not here at the time, but I hear a lot of people saying that there were not the resources that we had maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago in football. So what's nice is when I entered, there was a lot of packages ready for people to just get their hands with event data. One of the biggest ones is Andy's MPL Soccer. It basically taught me the idea of how I can illustrate pass maps, for example. FC Python taught me how to clean my data in a football sense. And there's really a lot of resources and a lot of people out there ready to help. And I was not expecting that. So what I always like to say is that my visualizations are good because the players make them good, and and that's what I like to say always, because the input really depends on the output. So it's really hard trying to get people to look at a visualization on why a player is bad. But I think the special thing about myself, I find, is that I was not afraid to say if a player was bad, even if the said player was, for example, loved by Manchester United. So I just wanted to take the image that was in my brain and produce it for everyone else to see, and be able to look at the visualization and show other people and be able to understand completely what's going on. And this was not necessarily limited to event data. It didn't have to be heat maps or pass maps. I was doing line charts and bar charts and using data from like Football Reference, and that was publicly got from StatsBomb. So then the StatsBomb's event data API, there's a lot of resources, which was nice because it allowed me to experiment. So a little bit about my role in Analytics FC. So I'm going to be breaking this down into 2 sections. What I do what my role is and what we do as a team. So a lot of my work is confidential, but I'm going to try to say as much as possible. So when you're looking at a player, let's say talk about Kevin De Bruyne, you have all of these characteristics that make up who this player is. So, for example, his assists, his chance creation, his goal scoring, his defensive contribution, his positioning. So it's messy. You have a lot to look at, and you don't know where to focus. And I basically like putting that all together and creating a narrative and presenting it in such a way that applies context to how a player's characteristics can contribute to a team and the way that they utilize him. And what's nice about that is then you can filter out the noise and begin to try to understand how players work as cogs in a machine, and begin to understand team structure. And that's why I go to the tools that we use as a team. So a lot of what we do, for example, is aiding players in contract negotiations. The only example, unfortunately, that I can talk about is Kevin De Bruyne, because we all know that he was he negotiated without an agent, and he freelanced our reports to basically curate such information for him. So what do we do? How do we help players? One of the biggest, funnest examples is salary benchmarking. So the thing that I work on, and which is really exciting, and what I really like is, and I find it's the perfect mold for me, it's because it's combining business analytics, data, and football all in one strand. And it's never really been done before because, again, when I was doing my Twitter platform and presenting these threads and articles to people, that the data wasn't really encouraged to be used. And it's the same actually when you look at it with players and agents. And so we had to find a way to basically try to present and make visualizations and present this data in such a very easy, simple way that anyone can understand it. And that was my skill here. So it didn't have to be something scientific. You don't have to have like a huge resources of skills. You can find your niche and find what you're good at and do that. So I put up some examples of what we do. So for example, salary benchmarking. We look at a player's wages and look at it in economic terms and see how we can model a player's contribution in economic terms and see how much a club is paying for his or her impact. There's also, for example, market evaluation. We can help players look at potential career opportunities and filter for league strength, player fit, and sporting ambition. Because what we don't realize, I think, as fans, is a lot of the decisions that we make in football. Personally, I'm a math lover, so I really thought that everything was calculated and everything was thought out. But when you look into it, actually, player ambitions can be random and they don't make sense. So that was a really interesting problem, because you had to find a way to build a model and find a player's best career opportunities based on this arbitrary idea of where he wanted to go. And we also look at, for example, projecting sporting success and seeing how, for example, the inclusion of one player helped a team reach the Champions League or the top four or winning a Premier League, and how without him, his exclusion, they're actually suffering. So it's all about looking at the big picture. And my favorite part is a lot of what at the end of the day, we're working with people, and people have different needs, have different wants. And what's fun is, and what I find really creative in what I do and what we do as a team, is building player-specific models and basically trying to insert data into ambitions and trying to see how we can look at it in the most objective sense possible. So that's pretty much what I do.
Can I ask, I'm going to pick on you about Kevin De Bruyne, because this is a discussion I've had with various people. And I read a little bit about you, how you did this analysis, or how Analytics FC did the analysis of Kevin De Bruyne. And isn't the problem with him is that Manchester City is so good, and they have a style of play which is very possession oriented. And of course, he's the key player with them. And so you can argue with statistics that most of the stuff goes through him in some way, but it's their system which works. And it might be possible to take him out. And in fact, he was injured for some period of time during December to I think March or something, and it went quite well for them during that time as well. So how do you sort of separate the team from the individual there?
I think that's a really good question. So I want to highlight that I was not there for the Kevin De Bruyne project, but it's the only one I can talk about. But that's a really good question, because when you're looking at a player in a very meticulous sense, you're trying to separate as much as possible and look at how, for example, his tendencies and his profile is in an individualistic sense, because a lot of players are affected by their systems. So we can flip the table, sort of. It's not just, for example, the system that can function with a player, but the system can, for example, make a player look better than who he is, or worse. So I think applying context is always important. And what we do in the models that we build and the data that we look at cannot be done without context. And that's what's important. Any visualization that I've ever made, I always try my best to look as much footage as possible to try to understand if, for example, this team structure is actually hiding this player's weakness, and really try to filter out the noise. I'm going to say this a million times. Filtering out the noise is really important, because football is a very noisy sport in general, and there's a lot of inputs, and at the end of the day is what you see is the 90 minutes in football, but a lot goes into it, and what goes into it, for example, may not be what we see. Not everything goes to plan. So that's what's really nice about it, is that you always have to apply tactical context, and that's where my role comes in, is always applying context and always looking at the bigger picture, and trying to see how the relationship between the player and the team, and use that relationship, for example, to see if it can be mimicked in other clubs, and find maybe if other clubs can do it better, and yeah, that's really cool. I really love what I do.
Yeah, and that actually relates. It is really cool. And we love that you love it, because we get so much out of that. And but this all actually relates to something I was kind of wondering as you were doing this, as you were talking about this. There's, I can't. You did mention having an economics background, that this is what you've been studying. It seems like some of that might actually come into play here. Have you been using your economics background in what you're doing?
Exactly, because in economics, we're always taught to look at numbers and graphs, and try to present any information in a graph, and seeing how, for example, one of an economist's favorite terms is ceteris paribus, and trying to, it's literally what I say, filtering out the noise, trying to see how one factor impacts the other factor, for example, excluding any other contributions for a specific model. So it's not only just in the literal sense, in the numerical sense, because my bachelor was a Bachelor of Science. I was always taught and to explain terms using numbers and data. So I was really comfortable with that when I started, and it really taught me and made me realize that, and what I do and at 6FC made me realize that there's this whole strand of football that we haven't even been exploring yet. It's this hidden gem of where economics and numerical terms and can intersect, basically. And it's quite funny because as football people, we're really obsessed with trying to find the perfect solution and the perfect system for a player to score. But when you sit down and look and analyze these things, there is no perfect system. And finally, what I want to say is actually why I love my job so much is because I feel like it's given me the perfect platform and made me realize that my economics background can actually add value in a creative industry like football. I don't have to work in a bank. It's just the way that I think and the way that I can produce content, present information can be valuable.
It's quite interesting. Now I'm going to actually be down on football, not on football, down on economics a little bit. I mean, my impression of I have a sort of negative image of economics, and it's maybe from when I was at university, that you just sort of learn these game theoretic ideas of, like, you know, maximizing some profit and supply and demand and those types of things. I mean, in an economics education now, do you learn game theory and all of those types of things as well? Is that part of, learn data science and all of those types of things as well?
Not in the not in as many details as I would like, because I think I always like looking at things in mathematical sense, and that my economics background helped me that, and trying to see like what's the best possible outcome, and how we can reach the best possible outcome.
Sorry, I was just
It's okay.
yeah.
But how we can reach this possible outcome. And when I started this, I was 19 and I was still in my last year of economics, and I was doing actually macroeconomics. And it had a lot to do with the bigger picture, the financial market, the global market. But I think I talked a lot about how I'm just a very curious person in general, and I feel like while an economics background is a great place to start because it opens a lot of doors for you, I think it's a good step to accessing other disciplines. And I think I'm planning to pursue a data science master's is what I'm trying to go with this.
Okay, so you still do need to learn the data science afterwards with this.
Yeah, I hope so, yeah, because I think it gives you a good background, because producing numbers and producing visualizations is no good without applying context and trying to analyze why, for example, this pass map looks the way it is. So I think you can learn from any background really, and apply that to football. It's just there's just really huge vacuum right now, and I think it's beginning to grow. Is that we're starting to see that football knowledge is not necessarily gained from just coaching or sports sciences. There's a lot of different disciplines that can go into this, and it's quite nice because
yeah, I think I'm particularly weak on the financial side. I'm not very good with my own money, and I always find it difficult to understand that. I mean, but of course that's a major issue, because these salaries of this player eats up so much of the budget of the football club and so on. And it's one thing to, you know, show nice pass maps and so on that they're a good player, but balancing that then against the financial value, that's a really important question.
Exactly. And remember how I said it is that a lot of it is intangible things that we really can't see for and why, for example, this club is offering this player this specific contract of these specific wages and this length, you know. So what we try to do is basically optimize that and see if, for example, this player is being actually underpaid in what the contribution that he's giving you, for example, his goals or his assists. And when you look at that even bigger picture and projecting your sporting success, is that, for example, you would not be in the top 6 without him. So trying to take these emotional ties and keep it as objective as possible. So we can then look at how, for example, this player can be utilized better and where he can be utilized better.
Do we want to ask one from the there's a question from the chat by Ethan who asks, are there any sort of standardized or widely used player comparison metrics used for analysis similar to the KDB project that you particularly like? For example, wins above replacement in baseball.
That's actually a really good question, because when you're dealing with, okay, so every player is his own project, and you're looking at these different positions and the roles that they play in these different systems are quite unique to each other. So while you want to, as much as possible, objectify it and try to filter out the noise and try to find a way, for example, to compare this league to this league, it's not completely possible, because at the end of the day, that you can't really standardize everything, especially given, for example, when you're comparing these players to different leagues. And when I talk about a player, for example, that wants to move from the Spanish league to the Premier League, you can't really, you can try as hard as possible to try, for example, filter for these for league strength. But for example, by looking at the pressure numbers or the distance that they ran or the average distance that players run for example, in that specific league. So you can just try to streamline it as much as possible, but the human factor is always important, especially given with football. It's all humans, obviously. So like that's why we focus on building specific player models. So trying to, for example, streamline these basic rudimentary framework that when you look at a player, you're going to say, okay, so we're obviously going to do this and this. And for example, for a striker, you're obviously going to look at his goals, his assists, his movement, for example. But then try to go a little deeper and see how, for example, this team utilizes these strengths, or how, for example, this team has increased his goal scoring, or the other way around, his movement, for example, has increased the entire club's goal scoring. And looking at, for example, the proportion of goals scored by this player to the entire goals scored by the club. So it's unique because there is always a creative input. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to the next piece, or?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm excited. I know what I actually have insider information on. What
now we're going to go into the technical stuff.
So math. So a lot of what I do is dealing with these very large event data sets, because at the end of the day, I'm not looking at a player based on 1 or 3 matches. I'm looking at an entire season's worth, and sometimes 2 seasons or 3 seasons worth. So I obviously can't, for example, put it all in one pitch, all of the goals that he scored, or all of the passes that he made, because it's large and I can't find similarities simply by my eyes. And I got introduced to the idea of clustering. So I really love this. So K-means clustering is really cool because it's basically this unsupervised machine learning method that can basically separate data points into, for example, a given number of clusters based on their similarities. And from that is, for example, let's say when you're talking about data sets, event data sets in football, let's say you have around approximately 2,000 events in a single match. And let's say 70% of those are passes. Obviously, it's the most common event type. And then when you take that into, for example, an entire season's worth, you have 38 games, and the numbers become too astronomical for you as a person to be able to look at these similarities and identify them by yourself. And that's where clustering comes in, because it basically does it for you. And it's really cool because passing, we can then basically streamline it and try to see similarities between how a player passes and how this player passes. And for example, the uniqueness of, for example, how a center back passes compared to the league average. So that's something that I really like about clustering. And one of the most important things I feel about clustering is that it tries to remove as much of the confirmation bias as possible, because as football watchers and as a person that watches a lot of football personally, you can be very influenced by what your eyes see and try to pursue visualizations and data that supports what your eyes see before actually trying to look at the objective truth. And that's what I like about clustering, because it tries to look at the similarities between the event data itself, and then you can begin to gain insight. So just a little bit technical about how it works is we basically assign these data points to a cluster, and we basically take the sum of the squared distance, we call this inertia, and the cluster centroid. So we arbitrarily put a centroid, and we try to basically minimize the distance as much as possible and take out as much variation as possible. So then we can look at how, for example, in this given cluster of passes, how similar they are to each other, but when comparing them to different clusters, how different they are to each other. And the way that we do that is, for example, by looking at the starting coordinates and the end coordinates of a pass, and try to, for example, look at the similarities between the distance of a pass and where it was made. 1 second. So just a little bit more math. I put it in a Voronoi diagram for the people that like to see it.
That makes me happy.
So I had to remember that I'm presenting to mathematics professors. So I do up my game. So that's what's really cool about it, because you have these millions of scatter points, because obviously when the more further down you go in a lineup, the more passes a player makes just naturally. For example, center backs do tend to pass more than your strikers. And when you're analyzing players like center backs and fullbacks where they're really involved on the ball, you have a lot of data. And you're trying to gain insights from it. And what we do is, again, is trying to implement a repetitive method of minimizing the variation. And basically, I put it in a Voronoi diagram to show you that how we look at a cluster centroid and try to minimize the gap as much as possible to the scatters themselves, and try to basically create categories within the data of, for example, how this passing group is different to that passing group. And we repeat this algorithm until the variation is as minimum as possible, or till, for example, as many clusters as you want. That's what's cool about K-means, is that you have a lot of autonomy in it and a lot of freedom as an unsupervised machine learning method. Okay, so this is something really important. I just really want to stress this. So for me, getting into clustering, K-means clustering, as a person that did not do any computer science or specific mathematics in my degree, I was prone to a lot of errors. And one of them is choosing an arbitrary number of clusters based on what I thought would make sense. And I've seen a lot of people that are really excited and really want to try clusters. And they're really excited to try to visualize and see the similarities, and that they get caught up in that, and they actually, for example, end up choosing this arbitrary number of clusters where we don't know if it's actually representative of the data that we have. So one of the best and easiest methods to do that is, and I always stress this, always try to methodicize and try to look at the framework behind anything you do, and try to basically apply logic to everything. Because at the end of the day, whether you're coding, whether you're applying a mathematical method, has to make sense. So elbow method is one that I really like. Remember the inertia that we talked about, which is basically the sum squared distances between the scatters themselves and the centroid, which is basically the variation. We want to have as little variation as possible. And okay, we want to have as little variation as possible. And obviously, when you're looking at passes, you want to gain insight from all of these different clusters. So you want to see, for example, for a center back, how he passes in like all of these different locations. But the problem with that is that you can run into overfitting, which is basically, let's say let's say, for example, you start with 3 clusters, and then you have a good distinctive measure of the data set that you have. But if you double that number, what you begin to actually do is not have a clear idea or representation of what the data looks like, because what you're actually doing is just redividing the subgroups that you initially had. And it's not really adding much information. And I like to look at it in an economic sense, is that the more clusters that we have, the diminishing returns, the information that we get is diminishing. So obviously we want to get as much value added as possible and try to gain more information and answer our questions before we started.
Can I ask a question? There's also a related question by Ninad in the chat that, I mean, it doesn't always look like that, does it, with the elbow? Like when you actually do it in practice. And it's nice you give the theory, and I appreciate you saying that you don't want to overfit or whatever, but normally it just looks like a mess. And, yeah. And you have to make some decision at some point.
Unfortunately, yes. And I don't necessarily like to, for example, limit the idea of trying to test it and for example, see how it looks and see if it makes sense. Because at the end of the day, human input is always important, no matter what you're doing. So yeah, I've run into a lot of issues. I was going to talk about that in a couple of slides, but like, yes, I have run into a lot of unique different issues with K-means clustering and the elbow method, where the data set doesn't actually have that similarities, especially when you're looking at something like passes. In real life, they don't tend to be really all that different. And then when you're creating such large event data sets over 3 seasons, they all start to be the same. So what's important is you don't cluster for the sake of clustering, and you don't just perform or create a visualization for the sake of it. Try to always look at the method and what you're trying to gain from here. Like with any visualization or anything that I do, I always try to ask, did I gain more information than prior to what I started? And what am I really learning from this? And if I look at this visualization by itself, what am I learning? What's new here that I didn't know previously before I started clustering?
I think one of the typical problems is that you reduce the variance quite a lot at first and it goes down, but then there's quite a lot of interesting clusters in a row, which might correspond to something. Often you have to look at the cluster. So I totally buy your point that, you know, you have to use this method to some degree, but sometimes it also is a case that you know that these clusters are a certain type of pass and you should keep them in maybe because they might not happen often, but they're an interesting pass.
Yes, exactly. And the flaw behind the elbow method is it doesn't really give us the set number of clusters. Really have to just choose within a given range after the elbow. So what I like to do is combine both. I don't like just arbitrarily picking clusters because then you can really fall into confirmation bias and just looking and seeing, well, this looks like it makes sense. Let's go with that. I try to always apply a method to things. So and try to step by step do it, because at the end of the day, I work as a consultant, and for example, if I want to help someone and supervise their work, I want to make sure it's as easy as possible to streamline it and automate it, and not just depend on a human factor. So yeah, I think that's what's really important.
Catherine apparently has disappeared. So she's had a electricity blackout in her apartment, so she's gone. So it's just the two of us. But she did want to say, she wanted to re-echo. She said in the chat there that the elbowing helps reduce the personal bias, which I think is something you've pointed out very well.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to just give you a couple of examples of how I use clustering. So what's nice about it is you don't have to necessarily just look at this huge data set of, for example, successful passes, because there are a lot, and is there really insight to be gained from such a huge event data set? So what you can do is, I like to look at a specific facet of passes. So for example, one of them is shot creations, looking at assists and shot creations and how, for example, the patterns within how a player and how a player passes and creates chances, but also how a player progresses the ball, because that's something really nice that you can apply to center backs and midfielders that was not previously possible, because obviously shot creations weren't really that relevant. And I put a visualization for you here to see how it looks before K-means. So as you see the noise that I was talking about, we can't really gain anything from this. You're just looking at a big blob of passes all over the pitch. The most that you can gain from here is that this player tends to be a very high volume progressive passer to a lot of areas in the pitch. That's all you can gain. But after K-means clustering, we can look at these different sections of how a player progresses the ball and try to gain insight from that. So this is Harry Maguire's progressive passes. He's a centre back for Manchester United, for anyone that doesn't know that. And what's quite nice is that he's a really high volume progressive passer, but it actually happens in valuable spaces in the pitch. For example, looking at the purple cluster, he tends to have a very good amount of central penetration. And when you look at that in context in terms of the modern game, the center of the pitch tends to be very congested, but it's actually the most valuable into trying to getting the ball to the final third and obviously scoring a goal. So if you have a center back that's willing to do that and able to do that, you can then see how unique he is in compared to, for example, the league's average of a center back. And what's nice is that you can try to get an idea of who, for example, where the specific cluster is directed to. So for example, the red one, the long range distance ones. So this is quite nice. The top receiver is Marcus Rashford. And like I said, when you apply context to it, you can then learn that and see that, oh, so he's supplying Marcus Rashford's runs into the back line and trying to get the ball as quickly as the final third. And he's really comfortable with long range distance passing. for example, one of the most interesting clusters that I found in this is those ones right outside the box. You don't expect a center back to have these central penetrative penalty box entries. So that was really nice and very interesting, because again, when you're clustering and trying to gain more insights than before you do, try to make sense and filter out the noise. And what I found here is in the pink cluster that in those penalty box entries that this player was actually given the freedom to push forward, carry the ball forwards, and then supply it to a forward and try to break the press. And he was quite comfortable doing that. So this is one example that you can look at clustering in an individualistic sense and look at a player himself. But that's not necessarily limited to that. K-means clustering is quite fun, is that it can process these very huge data sets. For example, you can process entire leagues worth of passes in 20 teams and in 2 leagues and 3 leagues. But again, you try to narrow it down and filter it as much as possible so you can actually gain specific knowledge and specific value than what you did previously. So one of the things that I did, I wrote an article on looking at how Manchester United's double pivot passes in the first 2 phases, which is build up and progression. And one of the reasons I actually started pursuing this was I was looking at Football Reference's progressive pass numbers, and it was ranking Fred as a very high progressive passer considered in relative to the squad. But I knew that that was not necessarily correct, because I did know about from my analysis and my tactical analysis that I knew that there was an issue with the build-up structure and just generally progressing the ball from the first phases to the final phases of the pitch. So what's nice is when you're working with event data and when you're working with clustering, you can actually limit the spaces that you want to look at. And I looked at, for example, the first phases. And the insight that I started to gain from this is something that does not necessarily granular and individualistic, but it actually tells us an idea about team structure. So for example, how Fred passes and build up is the purple and the blue cluster is really dependent on interacting with the fullback. So it means we can then, for example, infer that he has a very good relationship with the fullback, or he's very dependent on the fullback. So there's really a set of conclusions that we can make up with. It just depends on always looking and trying to apply context. And from there, I actually started to automate it and look at the entire lineup and see who best passes the ball and who best progresses the ball and build up. And using my
Can I just ask, can I interrupt with one question, please? Because Abhishek asks, and how do you define good positions in this? Maybe you said that, but you said they're good positions in build-up. What's the definition of that?
Yeah, I will get to that, definitely.
Okay, you'll get to that, sorry.
Maybe a good minute or two.
Yeah.
But I started looking at who progresses the ball best in build-up. And what I found was the fullback and the center back was actually, and the center backs, or 3/4 of the back line, was passing in a progressive rate higher than the actual double pivot. And when you apply context and look at it and say, well, Manchester United are playing in a 4-2-3-1, and that means the double pivot is really important for progressing the ball and getting them to the forwards. So then you go, well, either this player is not being utilized correctly and the build-up structure is flawed, such that he's not able to progress the ball in the system that he's under, or this player is generally not a very good progressive passer. And again, context is important. I found that it was a combination of both. Fred is not a bad progressive passer. It's just that he doesn't pass well in where he's most needed, which is the first and second phases. The second set of conclusions that I wanted to come up with is clustering is not necessarily limited to who's on the ball. You can actually look at who's receiving and who's being found in, for example, specific positions. And when I embarked on this project, I had no access to tracking data. And I wanted to see, for example, who's occupying good positions between the lines and to basically progress the ball higher up the pitch, because you're like, okay, while we as data people love to look at what's happening on the ball, what's happening off it is also really important, and because at the end of the day, you don't have much time, and the time that you spend on the ball for an average player is actually really, really short. So what you're doing outside of that is really important. And I didn't have access to tracking data, and I wanted to find a way to create my own unique metric to try to see who's being found in these good positions. And what I did was trying to see where players receive progressive passes. I used my own definitions for progressive passes, and the summary of it is, without the technicalities, is a pass that is 25% closer to the center of the goal, for example. And I looked at, for example, who was receiving such a type of progressive pass, because at the end of the day, for you to be able to receive progressive passes at a good rate, you also have to be occupying good positions for your teammates to find you in. It's a two-way street, you know. It's not necessary. Whenever you're looking at a passing, you also have to look at who's receiving. The relationship is quite important. And from there, I found that they were neither good progressors on the ball and off the ball. So this is a little bit about insight they can use to get an idea about team structure and looking at it in a collective sense. If anyone has any questions here, that's also great.
Well, I'm impressed by how you put it all together. Actually, I mean, I think it comes out as a simple picture in the end, but there's so much thought behind all of those different stages.
Exactly, and I think that's quite nice because before maybe when I was younger, when I was 14, 15, I had all of these ideas, but I just never had the tools and never had like the skill set to match it. I'm just in general a very ambitious and a curious person, and I didn't want anything to deter me from trying to answer my own questions. When I asked who's best found in good positions, I didn't say, oh, well, I don't have tracking data, let's move on. I wanted to find a way to do it myself and try to reach the best possible solution based on my logic. And
yeah, I think that's really important, because I think a lot of people feel that, well, we don't have tracking data, we can't do anything, we don't know this. And then you've actually revealed that, well, you can actually work out quite a lot without the tracking data.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about being creative, and I don't do it myself. I actually bother a million people and ask them my questions, but that's what's important, not to be afraid to ask a question, to try to reach a solution and try to reach a conclusion. So that's what's really nice. Most of what I do on Twitter and what I do in work was me in the beginning just trying to find the best tools as possible to create what I want. I didn't have I didn't know how to use Python, so I went into PowerPoint and Excel. So it's all about trying to create as much as possible as you have. You don't need event data, and then you don't need current event data to try to gain insight. I was making XG trend lines before, expected goals trend lines, and I was trying to gain insight from that. So.
And I had another thing, because there was a question came in that said, how do you know what's good or not is it from previous stats? But if I understood correctly, your answer to how do you know what's good or not is you define that this type of progressive pass is good, exactly. And which you define, so you define it basically from footballing knowledge, and then you work backwards from there to see how they're generating them.
Exactly. So it's actually a nice combination of using tactical structure and what you see with your eyes, and basically bridging that gap and finding ways to mathematize that and present that in a very easy, simple way, like clustering in a bar graph and in a pitch pass map. So that's that.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because I think that's another sticking point that people have, is that they want to know for sure what is the best metric, and they want to have a metric, like expected goals for passes or something like that. And we've certainly talked about a lot of that on Friends of Tracking before, how you create those types of metrics. But often it is just those things like, how quickly you get the ball back, how much you're getting the ball forward, just those key things which you can put down, and you can measure them for Kevin De Bruyne and find that he's the best player in the Premier League. It's those types of things are the important things.
Exactly. You actually built up quite nicely to my next slide.
Okay, good.
Well, I just wanted to, can I first that oh yeah, I'm back. It was apparently my entire neighborhood, but it came back luckily. And sorry that I asked that. I was like wanting to make that point, but then by the time, I got it on my phone, you had already brilliantly made it. But anyway, one of the things that a good point about this is that, because you were saying that people like the metrics, but yeah, a lot of it is that you have to like first categorize, like you want to compare the same thing, right? So one of the nice things about what you're doing right, is this point that you're clustering so that you know that you're comparing the same thing. You have a category, and like I can compare two things in there and see if they, you know, and compare their quality.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
That's why I always like to show the before and after, because then you can really see the insight in categories and the different numbers that clustering opens up doors to. So one of the ideas that I had for a couple of months, but unfortunately I couldn't have the resources to do it myself because I was busy with exams. But I basically reached out to a friend, and I had this project and an idea of trying to look at 1-2s, which is basically quick combinations of a pass between two players. So 1-2, 1-2, as we all know it. And what we basically wanted to see is try to gain an insight to, for example, who best engages in 1-2s and the player chemistry behind that. So for example, before K-means, you can see that all of the pink passes are a single stranded passes represent for both the initial pass and the final pass. And it's all around, all across the pitch. When I first initially plotted it, I had nothing to gain from this. I was like, oh, 1-2s are basically everywhere in the pitch. So that's nice, but that doesn't really tell us anything. But after K-means and trying to mathematize that, the conclusion that we reached was quite nice, because you can see that, for example, 1-2s are performed more frequently in the wide areas. But my favorite part is I'm just generally a fan that likes aesthetically pleasing things. 1-2s is one of the most aesthetically pleasing things as a fan. I like dribbles. I like 1-2s. I like players running at each other, but it's really hard to capture those things just simply because of how quickly they all move, and especially when you have access to the data. But when we tried to calculate 1-2s, we basically found that the second pass was actually, as you go further up the pitch, the second pass, which is the blue one, is actually more penetrative, more direct, and actually has a higher average distance. So that's nice. And then you can see that 1-2s are actually best used as offensive threats. So it's not necessarily that you're always trying to capture new ideas. You can basically reaffirm what you think and what you see in data, and try to gain knowledge from that. So the numbers were quite interesting. So Bruno Fernandes ranked highest as the top engager in 1-2s across the entire Premier League. And when you apply context to that, you can see that he's actually being used as a free roam 10 in Manchester United, with the freedom to go into all these different positions and help out players. And you can also look at it in a different sense. For example, Roberto Firmino is a false 9, and he's basically tasked with the role of facilitating the players and dropping it a bit deeper into center areas and quickly releasing the ball. So it's not also necessarily limited to forwards. You can find fullbacks. They're actually quite good at quick combinations, because at the end of the day, what's most valuable is trying to get the ball to the final third, but how quickly do you get it there? And you can see that we can then gauge it as an idea to try to see player chemistry and who best combines with each other. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be engaging in a 1-2 with a player you don't necessarily have a good relationship with. The data lined up quite nicely, but it's not always offensive. So when you look at the pitch, and you can see, 1-2s are more penetrative and more direct of a threat as you go further up the pitch. But that's not necessarily where they can also be used. So one of the best interesting examples, I'm going to be giving a lot of Manchester United examples. It's just the club I support. I'm sorry. But Fernandes and Wan-Bissaka had actually one of they were in the top 10 of combinations. And when I looked at that, I did a double take, and I'm like, why is the attacking midfielder having a very good combination with the right back? And when you dig deeper into the answer is, Wan-Bissaka is not necessarily a very good progressive passer in the first 2 phases. He needs help. And Fernandes was actually dropping deeper and trying to get him out of trouble to release the ball quicker. And he was using 1-2s. And just generally, Fernandes is one of those intelligent players that his brain actually moves faster than his feet. So you can see that how you can utilize that, not just in an offensive sense, but also just moving the ball forwards from your first initial phases. we also found that, for example, in Sheffield, that I think it was 3 or 2 combinations here that just from Sheffield United. And what's nice is when you add tactical context, you'll see that Sheffield United play a flat midfield 3, and they really utilize and stress importance on finding their wing backs. So there's a lot of nice combinations between the wing backs and the midfielders. So the data was quite nicely supporting what we were looking at, and that's always fun because unfortunately not everything that you see is lines up with the data. Sometimes I get very messy results, and as a Manchester United fan, when I'm curating numbers, I don't necessarily find results that I like. But but it's important always to look at it in an objective sense and try to see why the results are the way they are. Fernandez and Wan-Bissaka didn't make sense to me initially, but I tried to dig deeper and find insight from that. So I showed you how to. It's not just about clustering passes. You can cluster sections of passes. You can cluster progressive passes. You can cluster short creations. You can cluster 1-2s. It can be fun. It can be interesting. You can get new ideas from this. You don't have to conform to traditional clustering of, for example, how does this player pass? We can actually separate it into phases and try to look at combinations, who's receiving these passes, and how does this team structure utilize these passes. So any questions?
I had one question just off of the top of my head. Do you have any idea why Fernandez wasn't quite as good in the Euros now as he is with United? Because I mean, he was a revelation in United, and he's going around playing with everyone. I mean, he made everyone better. It seemed.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I saw a lot of fans actually getting upset that he was not picked in the starting lineup as frequently as he should have. A player of his quality, especially I think in the knockout stages, he was not in the starting lineup. It's because you have to always remember that while a player's profile is, for example, individualistic and unique to who he is, but the way that he looks in a system is always different, because it also depends on the way that they utilize him. So Manchester United like to give all of the freedom and responsibility to Bruno Fernandes. He can roam wherever he would like and engage in these 1-2s and engage in quick combinations with these players. But in Portugal, I was going to say the Arabic version of Portugal, which is Portugal, just a fun fact. Anyways, but in terms of Portugal, is that he's not given that much freedom. So we see, for example, less impact just simply because of how less responsibility that he's given compared to where he is in his club. So yeah, playing context. That was a nice nice question to share my point. Thank you.
Vinny had a question which I'm not sure I totally understand, but I'll pose it to you anyway and see what you make of it. He said, have you excluded keep the ball type of 1-2s when identifying 1-2s, maybe using the angle between the two passes?
Yeah. So we tried to, again, we don't have tracking data, but our idea was for 1-2s, we had to, what we wanted to see was basically, let's say Bruno Fernandes passes the ball to Wan-Bissaka, and then Wan-Bissaka passes it back to Bruno Fernandes. What we wanted out of 1-2s is basically making sure that there was a certain distance that the player that initially passed, which is Bruno Fernandes, to the end location of the final 1-2, and trying to see because at the end of the day, we wanted 1-2s that moved the ball higher up the pitch, not just combinations in your own half that resulted in nothing, because we're trying to analyze outputs. So there was a lot of interesting requirements that we put on it. For example, time. 1-2s are obviously quick combinations, so we put a limit of 2 seconds, I believe it was, for the entire sequence. So yeah, it's really fun, and you can apply your own creative ideas and try to take these concepts that you see as a football fan and try to mathematize it. And I just really love numbers, so this is really cool.
Cool.
Can there's something, and you did touch on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could expand a little on when you were saying that you could see compatibility between players a certain amount in this. And so I was wondering some of the methods you use to determine compatibility.
Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, so when you're looking at compatibility, whenever you're, for example, let's say you're going to begin your clustering, you can't just start with a data set of all of the positions and all of the players and all of the information. You need to in order to get specific results, you need to have specific input. We like to say garbage in, garbage out. And that the opposite is also true, because a lot of what I do is trying to streamline it, for example, in work and looking at the league average, for example. So in an attempt to compatibility and trying to find a similar framework to compare players to, you have to basically limit the type of players that you're looking at. For example, 1-2s was not relevant for me in my project, in my idea that I wanted to visualize to goalkeepers. That's not what I was trying to do. So I limited goalkeepers. I was looking at, for example, 1-2s that move the ball higher up the pitch. So it's all about conforming your idea and trying your best to narrow it down, to try to then compare players to it. Because at the end of the day, I can't just look at this list of players and say, oh, well, they all must have the same type of combinations, and it's all about clustering, trying to see, oh, where do they initiate their 1-2s and who are they initiating it to? So you have, for example, top combinations between strikers and wingers, but in the other sense, you also have top combinations with fullbacks and attacking midfielders. So that's what's nice. It's not necessarily, doesn't have to be streamlined. You can actually go, doesn't have to be automated. You can actually go and get really specific results with clustering.
Actually, there's one more thing, if it's okay, another thing I kind of was curious about, and this even came up a little bit, as so how do you work with the fact that, part of what a player is doing is what the coach wants them to be doing. And then, of course, also they might not be doing what the coach wants them to be doing, which may not be seen as a positive characteristic. But how do you kind of work with that and differentiate in terms of?
There's a lot of different examples. So what's important is, let's say you're looking at progressive passes. What's important is, for example, if you're really trying to get to the granular sense of how a player's progressive passing tendencies are, you're not necessarily limiting it to just successful passes that were completed, because again, that also depends on the recipient's touch. For example, his touch might not have been good and the pass was not properly completed. But again, not every pass just tells us specifically, it's not just about who's on the ball. So for example, progressive pass attempts is one of the ways that I try to do that. For if my initial results are not quite specific enough or don't match analysis and the tactical analysis that I did, you just always have to try to explore it further. Because at the end of the day, you have these different teams and different clubs playing these different formations and utilizing players in different ways. Because in one hand, you might have a fullback that's asked to push forward, but a fullback that's actually asked to conserve. And you can't just say, oh, well, so I'm going to compare this player's assists, for example, comparing Trent Alexander-Arnold's assists to Wan-Bissaka's assists, because at the end of the day, they're different profiles and they're asked to do different things. So it's always important to go back and look at what we're trying to analyze, which is players and the football match itself.
Can I ask, there's lots of questions coming in about definitions of 1-2s, which I think I'm not going to go into in great detail, but I want to ask a technical question about that slide on the left here. And one thing that I've done previously in a project when we do clustering is we make the same number of passes on each part of the pitch. So what we do is we divide the pitch into maybe 25 segments, and we take random passes. Before we do any clustering, we take random passes from those 25 segments, the same number in each of them. And that's to kind of make up, is to sort of boost the number of passes in the final third, which are more interesting. Do you do anything like that when you're doing your clustering, or do you just cluster off the raw passes?
Not particularly, but often I do like to, for example, see that passes that past a certain distance, or passes that are, for example, starting in a specific phase. So what we try to do with also further try to analyze 1-2s, we, for example, could limit it to final third passes and seeing how a player passes specifically and how combinations specifically look like in a specific phase. I think that's really interesting. I would love to implement your idea now. um, but yeah, it's always.
I think it's very good because, well, yeah, I suppose it's my own idea. I shouldn't say that, but it isn't. It is like, it is kind of important because we're interested in that. This is for clustering passes when you're interested in all players doing all sorts of different things. You don't want to just favor passes between the back line. Which there's lots of, you want to actually have passes everywhere on
yeah,
the pitch.
That actually brings up a great point, which is always try to. The thing is always try to think out what you're actually trying to look at. It's very hard because you have this idea in your brain, and at the end of the day, you're trying to get a machine to do it for you, and then do it for across a season's worth of data, for example. And it's a lot. It's more than 100,000 data sets, and it's always important to try to find a methodology to what you're doing, and try to make it specific as possible. Because at the end of the day, when we cluster, we're trying to find similarities. But when you're, for example, one thing that I don't particularly advise is just clustering passes in general, because the more passes are just the most common event type, obviously, and they're very high volume. So okay, so you can, for example, cluster passing types, and then you're like, okay, this player can, for example, can pass in these different locations. But no, and we can get down even further and look at, for example, how does he pass in shots that passes that lead to shots, and how does he pass, for example, passes that move the ball higher up the pitch? How does he pass with combinations? You can always just filter it down quite nicely. Yeah. Okay, should we move on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Okay, so I've just spent all this time telling you about how cool K-means clustering is. But it is cool, but with any model or any methodology that we apply, we always have to look at its flaws and try to take into consideration these flaws always with any data that we're presenting. So for example, whether it be the sample size, don't cluster a player's 3 matches or single match, because again, these are very high variance. It's a very high variance data set. So it's important to look at the sample size of what you're doing and try to, okay. So what I want to talk about specifically here is that the results that we gain from K-means clustering may not always be informative, because what we're doing with K-means clustering is try to reduce the variance. But an assumption that we're making with inertia is assuming that the data set is equally sized and spherical, but that's not always the case with passes. So we can actually end up with an incorrect number of clusters. For example, I put the pink passes to show you. I think I did this for a midfielder. It was an attacking midfielder, and when I clustered, I'm like, well, this cluster is not really telling me anything, because he's okay, sure, he's performing these passes, for example, deep in the left side of the pitch, but he's also performing these long balls. So is there really similarities between the cluster itself? No. And then you can also end up with unevenly sized clusters. So it can be the case that a player likes to progress the ball or has that one specific trait of progressing the ball. So for example, a lot of center backs progression is just long balls over the top. So there might not be other similarities to be gained from this. So you may end up with a case of unevenly sized clusters, because, for example, outside of these center backs long balls, it's just a very small data set and a very small sample size. Because when you look at it, so for example, let's say you're looking at a season's worth, and it's cool, and you have a lot of data, and you're assuming that you have a lot of sample size. But like David said, the actions can be actually skewed towards a specific facet in the pitch. So, for example, a lot of center backs, when you're looking at passing, a lot of the passing actually is with the center backs on the back line and in the midfield, not necessarily the strikers. So the level of scrutiny that you apply with each position is also important. So yeah, be careful when you're clustering and make sure that what you end up with is representative of the data that you started with. Okay, one thing I wanted to talk about is heat maps. So heat maps are super cool. They're a very nice way of looking at, for example, the territory a specific player occupies in the pitch. And I'm going to spare you from the maths on this one. So it's just an idea of kernel density estimation and just trying to look at where, for example, specific coordinates are most concentrated in, from low to high. So you can see that from, for example, blue to cold. And I find that heat maps are one of the most popular types of visualizations that I see based on the Twitter platform. And a lot of people have this huge excitement to making them. But like I did, you can fall into these certain traps and certain mistakes that you get from making heat maps. So I first initially started with non-filtered seaborne heat maps. It's the one on the top, on the far right. Yeah, that's far right. There we go. It's on the one on top far right. It's the blue one. So this was my first heat map. I didn't use converging color maps, so that's the first mistake. Because when you look at the difference, for example, from those blue heat maps to the pink one, you're actually kind of trying to see the difference between the territories you occupy instead of using, for example, a blue gradient. Because all I can see from that is this player occupies territory most concentrated in the opposition half and maybe in the half spaces. That's all I can get. But I'm not really saying about his penalty box penetration. I'm just getting a very blurry image. So then I started using fun color maps, and one of them was non-filtered seaborne, and again, still seaborne heat maps. And I started using converging color maps. And then from there, you can actually get to see the granular details of, for example, where a player receives his passes or where he initiates his passes. But one of the most interesting developments I find, and one of the most useful developments that I've made in my visualizations, was moving from seaborne heat maps to filtered bins. And it's basically the idea of smoothing it out and trying to filter out the noise. Because what's nice about bin filters using pitches, because then you can actually contextualize the pitch and in which dimensions you're specifically looking at. Because when you're using seaborne heat maps, you're basically applying a filter over the pitch. But when you're doing bins, you're just basically dissecting it down. And then you can, it's much easier for anyone or any person that's looking at a heat map. Oh, so this is where I'm looking at. And the issue with seaborne is that it can lead to, since we're just assuming a convex shape, it can lead to it just basically circling around an area where a player just had that very little touches, and it's just not giving us the entire full picture. So that's why I moved into bins, to try to look at, again, trying to always make it a little bit more specific and trying to always gain value from any visualization that I do. Because at the end of the day, when the thing with clustering and the thing with heat maps is that you can't really add, and you're trying to can't really gain insight from, for example, categorical values, like trying to see aerial passes, or trying to see basically adding labels to your data set. You can't do that, and that's one of the flaws. But what you can do is try to zoom in what you're really trying to find, and really focus specifically on, for example, a player's territory. So I used Paul Pogba here to best illustrate my answer. So all of these are Paul Pogba's territories. They're the exact same pitch. They're the exact same coordinates. And I used this season specifically because he played in a proliferation of positions. He played in the double pivot, and he also played right wing for a certain time. He played in the double pivot. He played right center midfield. He also played left center midfield, and then finally he ended up in the left wing. So you when you're trying to look at, okay, where does this player really like to receive passes, and where's the positions that he's being found in, it's always important to look at and look back at the data and saying, oh, where is he actually playing? So I found that across all of these entire different positions, Paul Pogba really likes the half spaces. So and really, so he's not being used, for example, when he's playing left wing, he's not really used in a traditional sense as a winger that's hugging the touchline. He's actually occupying the half spaces. So that's what's really nice, because then you can combine all of these different positions and you can basically try to get an idea of where a player is being asked, and where a player likes to be found in, and where he, for example, initiates his passes. And you can also look at it in it's not just generally about the player itself. You can also then compare heat maps, for example, between a winger and his fullback. So yeah, so if you have any specific questions about heat maps, please go ahead.
I'm just happy to see Gaussian processes on the, we haven't had anything on Friends of Tracking on this before, and it's something I use in my other research. So it's very nice to see this used, and I really like the attention to detail with getting the map right. I mean, I think I've before been quite nasty about the who's scored heat maps, which are even worse than the one that you have on the right there. And you really sort of nailed it down and made it lovely. So no, that's great. You're getting a lot of, I wanted to add, you're getting a lot of love in the chat for your heat maps as well. So
also for your explanations, just yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's really.
Ashwin loves your explanations. He said he usually turns off when people start talking about math, but he feels like he's really understanding. So.
Okay. I'm very glad I'm
math, Maram. You did it.
Now I think I just have to get Ashwin to start listening to me when I talk about math, and then I think I am gonna make that. I've made it. But yeah, what's important in any mathematical process and anything that you're doing is not sacrificing aesthetics for. I really liked gradients when I started out. I loved looking at. I just liked the idea of going from the same color map and from, for example, where it's least concentrated to most concentrated. And while it looks nice, is it really adding information? No. So always try to see if you can improve the way that you present the information, because what you have can be, for example, a very good specific set of value, but how you communicate that to other people is really important. A lot of what I do is making reports for players and for agents to look at. And sometimes, for example, when you present a certain set of information that a player might not agree with, that I'm telling him, for example, you're occupying actually lower space in the pitch, and then he's be like, well, no, I didn't do that. And then you have to always be able to back up your answers and try to see, and try to give as well detailed as an answer as that, because and then if they know your audience, I know it took me a while, but I finally got my audience and try to see what and try to apply my unique characteristics in the way that I do my visualization. And that actually brings me to my final slide, which is my visualizations are a reflection of who I am as a person. I'm just generally very bright and bubbly. I like neon and I like bright colors. But it's important to take your aesthetics and take who you are as a person and what you like to do and how you present that in your visualizations, because at the end of the day, that personal touch is what differentiates me from others. And then a lot of people talk about my neon maps, and it basically sets you apart from the others, because reaching a really congested part of time in football where there's actually a lot of people getting into data visualizations, especially in Twitter, and it's really hard to get your voice out there and trying to create your own unique visualizations. I've been here for 7-8 months. I've been only creating visualizations for around 6 months. So
wow.
What I learned from that.
I've been doing it for 6 years and they don't look anything like yours.
What I try to do best is try to always capture unique ideas and then try to reflect what's the best possible way to present this information. So before, my visualizations were focused on single matches. I was looking at an entire team's territory, first and second half. That was obviously not the best way of doing things, because when you obviously also look at the pass maps, I don't know how I was analyzing that. That was a really messy pass map. But then you can cluster them and filter out the noise and smooth them out in both your heat maps and your clusters, and then you can begin to gain insight. It's just always important to look at the bigger picture. Like, I see a lot of metrics, and one of them is, for example, expected goals. I see a lot of it being used incorrectly, in such that people use them in single match data, when that's not really the case, because you're trying to identify long-term trends and then trying to identify patterns. So especially, for example, when you're creating metrics, for example, this player's key passes per 90, it's always important to look at the sample size. You can't just use it for entire season's worth. And for example, then you end up finding that he's only played 390s. So that means the data that you're getting is not really representative of who this player is, because again, football is random. And at the end of the day, no matter how much we try to streamline and automate it and be able to like find a compatible method to comparing one player to another, football remains random. And I think we've best seen that in the Euros this season. Is that single knockout ties don't make sense, and we're looking at single matches. A lot of random things can happen, and no matter how much plan and thought you put into it, it might not always look like the final picture. And that's what's important as well in visualizations. Just make sure that the idea that you're trying to capture is present. And one thing that I always stayed standard in all of my visualizations from start to finish was annotating them. A lot of people just put the heat map, post it, and then put the caption on Twitter. But what you don't realize is you want to have, when you're creating these visualizations and images, you want to be able to combine and the information and the value that you're adding, for example, from a heat map, by looking at it at the same time. So a lot of people put the captions and then put the heat map, but it's not the best way possible, because you can put them together and try to show exactly what you're talking about. And as my profile got bigger, I noticed that a lot of my stuff was being shared. What was important to me that if anyone copies the image and posts it in another platform like Reddit, you can take the image anywhere and still understand the value and the information that I was trying to get out from it. So a lot of the famous people that I've seen and when you look at their process of how they started and how they ended, they never ever show where they started. But it's always about the end product. For me, it's all about my process, and where I started is really important to me, because I had the courage to. I'm an Arab Muslim person of color, and I'm not there's not a lot of me represented in football, and I was really scared. I didn't actually tell my parents for a while that I was doing this. For 2-3 months, I did not tell them, but I actually got support when I did. So don't be afraid to show your process and try it out. It's, for me as a perfectionist, it's very easy to try it always has to be perfect, but not necessarily so. Football isn't perfect. So this is like comes to the conclusion of my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, that's pretty much my experience. And if you have any questions, please.
Well, I mean, it's been brilliant. Yeah, I feel like we have to clap. But there's actually something, because you brought this up, and I was going to actually ask you 2 questions at once, and then say that you could just disregard the second. I feel like women in a field that doesn't have a lot of women, I feel should have a choice whether or not they answer what it's like for them. But there's somebody did ask about this, and since you kind of brought up how it was for you to be coming from a little bit different of a background, you can also say that you're not comfortable answering this, and then I'll give you the next question. But if you did want to explain, I think there are a lot of particularly young women who would love to hear. Yeah.
No, definitely. I definitely want to answer, because I've realized that along the way that people actually really listen to what you're saying. It's really easy to feel not important and the things that you're saying is not valuable, but then turns out you're actually representing a specific community. And it was not always this easy process for me. It was not, I didn't go from A to Z quite easily with it. It never had, I did run into issues along the way, and I just had to find a very good support system for me and not be afraid to ask questions. When I started, I had my profile picture, it was my face, for around 4 to 5 months. And I used to get abused in my DMs just by simply existing, and by being who I am really bothered people that I was there. But that only pushed me stronger, because I realized that there was not enough people like me. And whenever I went to search on YouTube or anything, it was really rare to find a Muslim hijabi woman talking about football. It was just not an occurrence. And it's just always important to keep going and have the courage to try and do what you want to do. football for me was a hobby around a year ago. It was
Mm.
not more than something that I watched for entertainment, and it's become my career, and it's something that I look forward to every day. And that's what's important is if you love it, keep doing it. Don't let anyone stop you, because certainly I didn't have the full support that I needed in the beginning. Not everyone wants the best for you. You just need to find a very good set of people that you're not afraid to ask questions to.
Mm.
Always, whenever I make any visualization, obviously the ones that are not confidential at work, but whenever I make any visualizations, I have to bother at least 3-4 people with it and try to get as much constructive criticism as possible.
Mm.
But this is the reason that I agreed to do Friends of Talking and do interviews and stuff like that, because obviously you're brilliant people, and I'm really honored to be on something like
Mm.
this, but as well as knowing that people like me are seeing me represented in that can encourage others. And that's also the reason why I like to keep my direct messages open,
Mm.
because while it does offer people a platform to come and just abuse me, but like it also offer, if it helps one person, then it's worth it for me. So um, for me, it was always important to set an example. Uh, I come from a family of three. Like I have one sister that's a doctor, and I have another brother that's an accountant. And while I love
I
them
have
to
a
death,
sister that's a doctor too. Anyway, go on.
so while that's cool and that's really interesting, it was just I never saw myself in an orthodox traditional path. Um,
Mm.
and football here, especially the women's football, when you see women watching football, it's you get a lot of comments saying, I'm watching it to get people's attention or guys' attention," but that's
Mm.
not true. So just eventually, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're gonna get noticed.
Mm.
That's something that I never realized, that a lot of important people do actually open up and look at your work. So keep it. I still keep everything that I've ever produced on Twitter is still there, because I like to show people my process.
Mm.
Um, I got noticed for my threats, something totally random, and then so don't be afraid. Someone's always out there, and someone's always looking, and just have a very good support system. The friends that I've gained along the way, this Twitter journey over the past 6 months have been amazing, and eventually you'll get there. Yeah.
There's lots of research saying that the more diversity you have in a working environment, the better that working group performs. And I think, and that's easy just to say as an abstract thing. And when they do research on it, it's kind of abstract questions that they're getting people to solve problems. But I mean, you're sort of living proof of this, because exactly as you said, there's lots of people who are trying to do those types of visualizations now, and yours stand out because you came with a kind of unique perspective and your own perspective, and it gives you that bit of an edge, really, or quite a lot of an edge actually, over because you have that unique way of seeing things.
Yeah, I'm actually a person that hates public speaking. I can't do it at all, but I still always try to challenge.
Wait, no, it's not that you can't do this. You're doing this brilliantly. What are you talking about? Anyway, go on.
It's really hard. I've practiced maybe like 6 times, but I'm saying don't let your fear stop you, or any deterrence really. I didn't have. I never expected that my economics major would be useful in football, but it was. I never expected that Microsoft and PowerPoint, these free, easy tools, can actually help me with my visualizations. So and even further, like if you don't have event data, create your own and you can track your own. There's just so much creativity out there, and just realizing that your voice really matters and people are looking at it. So that's quite nice. I always try to remember that at the end of the day, even if it's one person, I started out with 0 followers, and then for a while it just stagnated at a really small number of followers, and I was always had it in mind that if at least one person looks at this and gains value from this, that means I've done my job here. Uh, and while it's important to like maintain your objective and why you're pursuing, for example, a specific journey or a specific career path, just make sure that you like it. Not feel pressured. I'm not. I felt, for example, a little bit pressured in terms of the tactics side when I first started, because I never took any professional coaching or tactics course. It was just what I saw. I never really thought it was something special or unique. I liked numbers, and I was afraid that people were not going to be receptive to numbers, and when I was making visualizations, they would have thought, like, for example, it was not the best way to present the information. The eye test is better, you know.
Mm.
Uh, so just make sure that your content is true to who you are and what you want to do as a person. And that's, I know that sounds a bit deep, but at the end of the day, when you're producing such regular content for a very long time, and if you don't have that motivation and that creative spark that keeps you going, then you can't just keep following the trends. Is what I'm trying to say. Follow
Okay.
your
So speaking of somebody that that you turned on to being happy with numbers, I promised a long time ago in the chat that I would ask this question. So before I forget, if it's okay, before we do anything else, I promised Ashwin that I was gonna ask at the end, because I wanted you to be able to compare with the stuff you've been doing. Because he asked about the difference between your work in data visualizations and your work as a consultant. Yeah.
Okay, so when we started this project, we'd not anticipate the number of the number of clients that we would receive. It was not as a big a team as you think it is. So when I came in, I was doing all of the analysis myself, and my perfectionist need. And I'm a bit of a control freak, which sort of leads me to want to do everything myself. But the bigger that you go with your project and what you're doing at work, and the bigger that you go with your data sets, is the more that you need to automate your processes. And this is why I'm called a data consultant, because what I'm trying to do is automate it for other people. So for example, when I can't do it, I don't have the time because I'm trying to, for example, design the visualizations or trying to collect the information or add context, I need to be able to pass it off to someone else and, like, here you go, this is a process. If you need anything, just ask me. Because you can't control everything, and it's something I have obviously had to accept, because you've heard me talk about for like 10 minutes about how my visualizations are unique to me. So I always wanted to present them the best way possible, but I had to realize that my job is that's not always the case, because let's say you're working on 2, 3, 4 reports at the same time. You can't do all of it. So you need to be able to pass it on, and I always try to, and then the consultant part of it is not the majority of my work, but it's still there, because it's basically still while it doesn't represent the majority of my work, it's still an important part of it, because it's always trying to be able to streamline and automate the data and what you're doing. That's my biggest advice, really, because before I used to spend an entire 2 days just creating one visualization. I was not, and I was a full-time student. I was not studying when I was doing this. That was awful.
I was interested in this thing with perfectionism, because actually my wife studies some of this perfectionism in mathematics and so on, and it's a sort of double-edged thing. So of course it's a positive thing that you can spend 2 days getting your visualization right, but what also tends to happen is it becomes a sort of extra pressure that you have to deal with. And in particular, you find that women tend to be more perfectionists than men are. I can certainly count for myself. I am not a perfectionist. And then it becomes a sort of, it becomes a sort of more, it has a negative side as well as a positive side.
Exactly. Because I really enjoy when people tell me that my visualizations look good. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the opportunity cost. I'm going to be speaking like an actual economist for now. Just looking at the opportunity cost. Is it really worth what you're doing? You're spending 5-6 hours when you can be doing something else. Like the 5-6 hours that I spent creating one visualization, I can be creating 3, 4. And it's all about letting yourself go a little bit. I used to make, I had it that I have to, so like results and everything, I process it in Python, but like I was like, I'm gonna edit all of them myself in Photoshop or PowerPoint, whatever it is. But I had to let it go after a while. And you have to try to find innovative, creative solutions. I'm trying to find ways to design my own things in Python. It represents a bit of a challenge for me as a beginner, but always trying to kind of to improve and learn is something nice. So yeah.
It's interesting. That's a perfectionist analysis of being a perfectionist.
Well, I think this is interesting that the thing that you say about women, because this shows up also in soccer, women soccer players. Like I kind of noticed this, and then I'd heard people definitely say this. For example, it's hard for perfectionists who are more likely to be women, to be okay with the fact, like the percentage of the times that you shoot and you actually score a goal is it's not even more than half the time, and that's really hard for perfectionistic women. Like they feel horrible that they shot the ball and then it didn't work out. And so for a lot of women, it's something to actually overcome in soccer.
Exactly, yeah. And like a lot of what I do is like when I'm working on these different players, and it's not necessarily that I've watched them, so I have to be able to recognize that not everything can be perfect, because, for example, I may not have the proper information that I need to be able to do this. So this arbitrary definition of perfect that I had to keep changing based on what I was doing, and trying to accustom myself to unique situations, because again, football is random, and I had to accept that the industry that I work in is random. So don't be afraid to change, and rebranding for me was very hard, because it was the first time I actually invested in myself. I actually like put proper money to for someone to design me the logo, and it became serious, and I was really scared, and then it had to be perfect. Yeah, just don't be scared, because at the end of the day, don't what you're trying to do is, what I try to do is curate this large set of information in very, very simple, easy terms. So making it perfect is not necessarily the best way to do that. Sometimes presenting the information and showing people that it can be messy is the way to do that. So it's all about just trying to find the, they're not trying to, for example, fit a square hole in a circle. It's just trying to find the best way possible for each situation.
Oh, that's really inspirational stuff here at the end. Fantastic.
Yeah, I think we so what do you say? We've gone a little bit over time. Were there last questions you want to ask, David, or shall we?
I just wanted to read out one comment, because it was just my absolute favorite. You should have a look at the comments in this last section. But Ninad wrote here, after seeing your visualizations, please report there's been a robbery at the Louvre. So so there's a lot of there's things about that these should be hanging in I mean, you should actually be looking into this fungible whatever it's called. I have no understanding of these things, but this the original fungible thing for some of your posts. Actually, I think that they could go up. In fact, I shouldn't have said this. I think I'm going to try and buy one from you later on.
That actually brings up an interesting point, because I was actually initially when I was making my visualizations, I'm like, wow, these are really pretty, but I'm scared people don't find this pretty, and for me, what I didn't realize at the beginning was that making it pretty is not just about having it look aesthetically pleasing. It just makes it easier for the person to digest the information, and just more willing to open up the image and just look at it. But like, yeah, I'm planning on commissioning some of my visualizations, so if anyone's interested, please contact me.
Well, there's something to this, and there's actually something that I found kind of cool, which is that, I mean, there's for those of us, probably you're the same way, and maybe all of us are the same way, who really love things like mathematics and so we see beauty in it. And one of the nice things about soccer is that all of a sudden, like, so when it's somehow you're like kind of pulling out and accentuating what we see as the beauty in it. And it's kind of cool being able to finally share that with like a larger audience. Like you can create these kinds of visualizations and say, well, I don't just see the beauty of like whatever, I see the beauty of how the system evolves. I see the beauty of, these patterns that are showing up. And
one of the things that one of the biggest changes in the way that I started looking at football before and after I started, I actually really like Roblox right now. I love the way that as a football watcher, you're just like, this is boring, this is really conservative. But like when I grew a larger understanding of tactical concepts and how complex implementing such a rigid system can be, I actually started appreciating it more. So this is a bit too deep, but there's kind of beauty in everything when you look at it. That's always nice.
Well, and that is, and so in some form, and you're doing this so brilliantly, which is to capture that beauty and to communicate it. The beauty that you're seeing in the structures and the patterns and so on. And so that's a great thing that you're being able to share that. So
thank you so much, really. That's really kind.
Okay, so it is on the we still got a lot of people who've stuck through for all this time, and I'm sure there are going to be so many more who are going to watch it later, and many comments about how much everybody's really loved this and found it informative and so on. So, so much for coming on.
Having me, really, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for giving me the platform to just talk. I'm really talkative. Thank you.
No, it's been fantastic, and I think that it's going to inspire a lot of people of every different kind of background, and so I feel like you said that was a goal of yours, and I feel like you definitely will have achieved, this in doing this. So
it's always nice that there's there's no specific end point. You can always continue. It's a process, and that's really nice. Thank you. That's really kind.
Thank you for your courageousness also in and being that voice. So
yeah,
thank you.
It matters to a lot of people. So thank you again. And do you want to do like and subscribe, David?
Oh, I can. Okay, I will say the last thing that yes, if you've liked today's program, please subscribe to us. I think Maram's a lot better. She went to 20,000 subscribers very fast.
Maram, would you like to actually?
Yeah,
Maram, could you just say the subscribe thing, please?
Yes. There's a lot of shamelessness in getting 20,000 followers, so you should get it. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe to Friends of Tacking down below. I'm guessing.
Amazing. And I guess this is the last of this season, but we plan to be back in the fall. I hear rumors between David and I. So, and we've already been thinking about some of the people we're excited to have in the fall. So, so thank you again. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody again in the fall. So have a wonderful summer between now and then. Bye.
I think we